Well, Pam, do you remember when we used to do these with the slide carousel? Kodak slide?
And a prayer.
Yeah, and in the old days too, we had music here. You remember that? Cassette tapes in here, and we'd play those.
Wow.
Yeah, that was. It comes flooding back when every time I open this building up, I think of those memories. Well, we'll go ahead and ease into it. I'm looking out there in the parking lot. I'm not seeing any new arrivals, so we might as well go ahead and get started. And I'm Ranger Harman. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and to be able to talk to you about life in a northern town. Wills and David Wills, Catherine Wills, Abraham Lincoln, life in a northern town. So I want to give you a sense of how this town represented a lot of towns in the 1860s. And that Lincoln came here and saw a culture here that he would have found in many towns all across the North at that time. And so let's go ahead and begin with that then. Wills and Lincoln, life in a northern town. David Wills, Catherine Wills, and their 3 children hosted Lincoln and had them stay in their house. That house will be open tomorrow from 11 to 4 if you're able to visit. It's in the town squares where Lincoln completed the Gettysburg Address. So let's just jump right into our story then of life in a northern town and Lincoln's visit as it relates to that. Okay, what are the common threads to life in a northern town in the 1860s? There's 3 major themes that you would find in towns throughout the United States, particularly in the North. Modernism, Victorian culture, which is sometimes called antebellum culture. Sometimes cultural history refers to it as sentimentalism. But it's a distinct culture, like if you're a child of the 80s or the 70s or the 90s, there are distinct features from your culture. The video games, the muscle cars, the television shows, the movies that were popular, the clothes that you wore. And I've spent most of my adult life studying this Victorian culture. So I'll share some of it with you. And Lincoln would have recognized the Victorian culture when he came here. Also, another common thread to a northern town was nationalism. And so the idea that the country was becoming more connected by modern transportation systems and no longer a state-oriented union, but a union of states, but rather a nation. I will identify all 3 of these threads throughout the presentation to make clearly the underlying dynamics that held together northern towns in mid-19th century. Okay, David Wills, who hosted Lincoln at his house for the Gettysburg Address, was 33 years old in 1863, lived there with his wife Catherine, their 3 girls, and a 4th child on the way. They purchased the house in 1859, turned it into a single-family dwelling. This is an 1858 Adams County map showing the Roman grid that the town was set up with. And you may know that Roman grids came from military Roman camps. It's the idea of street signs came from Roman military camps where they would have flags along each grid or row representing what legion was there. And it's the idea of grids create hierarchy. I'm going to relate this to Wills. Grids create hierarchy where there's someone at the front of the grid and then there are people after the grid. So for instance, a teacher stands up in front of a classroom and there are rows and rows and rows of chairs. The teacher has the big desk, the kids have the small desk. They're in a Roman grid, the teacher's at the front. The rectangle shape of the room with the teacher at the front and the Roman grid system communicates order. And at the top of the order then is the teacher. And then the students flow from that. He or she is at the head of the classroom. Now, rectangles always denote inequality. When you sit this Thanksgiving at a rectangle table, if you do for Thanksgiving dinner, whether they want to or not, someone's going to have to sit at the head of the table because rectangles denote inequality. Circles denote the opposite. King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, right? So Roman grids denote inequality. Inequality. Have you ever seen a CEO chart? There's someone at the top and then there are brackets that work their way down. Rectangles denote inequality and order and hierarchy. And so the town is set up in a Roman grid. And this is just bonus material, but if you see a town that's got Chester connected to it, or Castor, that's the Roman word for, the original Latin word castor, for Roman military camps. And so they would set them up with tents and rows and grids and things like that. So the Gettysburg's skeletal framework is based on an old ancient Roman idea. And the Wills lived right at the top of the hierarchy. They were like the teacher at the head of the classroom. Location, location, location. They were in the center of town, and then all of the smaller houses were behind them. And you can see their house on the square. It was originally what we would consider a department store that Lincoln stayed in. It would be like you buying a Kohl's building today, or an old J.C. Penney building, and turning it into a single-family dwelling. It was actually a dry goods store when it was built in 1816. And they would have sold bonnets and straw hats, pitchforks, shovels, barrels full of dried beans, all kinds of tobacco, and anything you can imagine for farming, buttons and fasteners and cloth. That's what it was originally. The Wills got a loan through David Will's father, James Wills, who was the president of the bank across the street. There's a PNC bank there today, you know, and that's probably how they got the home 4 years before Lincoln's visit. It screams head of the table. It's one of the tallest buildings in town. So Will's house is on the right. The Tyson Will's house is to the left. And today there's a nice malt ice cream shop on the building on the left, but it's originally also the Will's house. We call it Tyson's Will's, hyphenated, but Tyson didn't own the building. Tyson were photographers who rented out the second floor. This is the 19th century entrepreneurial spirit. If you study 19th century history, the 1800s, that's when capitalism starts to become recognizable and overtake mercantilism. People, once the high orders are removed, that's the Tories, and we talked about them being tarred and feathered the other day, Pam. But when the Tories were exiled to Canada and to Great Britain, the upper classes left the country. There was a vacuum, and so people that were really had been the middling sorts, lower sorts. There weren't any classes, so to speak. They were caste more than anything else. But you could, with this new economic system, work your way to the top. And the Wills did that. They dabbled in all kinds of things. David Wills had a law office. He also sold in the Tyson Wills house next door queenware, which is a form of ceramics. They also had a diamond store at one point. This is a picture of America at the time. I'm trying to show you Lincoln wouldn't have been out of place visiting here. Americans were starting to learn how to, through entrepreneurship, make their own money and raise themselves by their own bootstraps. Carnegie went from shining shoes in front of the factory to owning the factory. Lincoln went from the log cabin to the White House. That was a 19th century spirit. It's called individualism, entrepreneurial spirit, rise of capitalism, overtaking more of a locked-in system called mercantilism. When Lincoln entered into the house, he would have most likely come through this door. It's on the York Street side. That's the side that visitors enter the Wills house today. If you go there tomorrow, I want you to notice the elliptical fan window above it. It's going to make sense a little bit later, but that's a symbol of federalism. In the early 1800s, that was the architecture in America. Federalism is ancient Greek and Roman design that's sort of flattened out and simplified. There's still columns and pillars and low-pitched roofs like you might find in ancient Greece, but they are painted white typically and connected to brick. So this house was built in 1816 by the Cobeans. They also own buildings that are park offices just outside of town on Carlisle Road. And the elliptical fan-shaped window screamed to anyone that was older like Lincoln, federalism, federalism, federalism. Federalism is a loose grouping of states that govern themselves with a central head. Okay, so that's, but Lincoln would have come in there and he would have hung up his hat and his top coat. You have to remember, they didn't have daylight saving time. He got there about 6:45. It would have already been getting really dark when he arrived by train. When he walked in the house, there would have been gas lighting. You ever been in a house or been in a campsite where they're using kerosene lanterns? So Lincoln would have only been seen by the flicker of the lanterns. My wife was an art teacher for 30 years, and she says, take time to paint the picture. There's always a visual learner. So that's what I'm attempting to do. It would have been pretty dark when Lincoln came in the house, except for the gas lighting that David Wills helped bring to people's homes. In the first Industrial Revolution, that was a big deal. Later on, Tesla and Edison in the second half of the 19th century bring electricity to people's homes. The gas lighting, did you know there was gas lighting in Gettysburg? You still had to have someone take an extension and push a globe up from the ground and light it. That person was paid $9 a month to do those sorts of things. Okay, and so you come into the house. You can see the York Street side at the bottom. That's probably how Lincoln entered. Most people would enter into a foyer that was just to hang their hats, hang their shawls, prop their walking stick in the corner. Victorians were very conscientious about each room has its own separate purpose. You didn't mix purposes. Today we take a laptop into the kitchen and eat there. Victorians would never do that. You did your work in your office and you ate in the dining room, and you weren't even allowed to see the cook if you had a little bit of money. The cook was outside cooking in a wood stove in a separate building to make sure if there was a fire, it was contained in that building. And also to keep the heat out of the house. We're throwing in a little bit of social history here. I know some of you appreciate that. Also, in some wealthier homes, you would never even see the cook. And even probably would never see more than one waiter. The food would come through a dumb waiter. You'd pull a rope from the basement, and the food would come up through a trap door. Today, we sit in a kitchen, and you can see the kitchen sink and the stove, and you can look in any direction and probably see a sweeping view of your whole house. We have very few sections and barriers in houses. Victorians had sections and barriers between everything. They were very social conscious. The cooks were not to be seen. And although the cook, she apparently opened a swivel door and looked at Lincoln. Lincoln must have noticed her, and she told that story the rest of her life. But the idea of separate rooms for everything. By the way, you know when all the separate. My wife and I own a Victorian home in downtown Gettysburg, the old Tate House, Surgeon Tate, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. We've been restoring it for years, and it's just sectioned off. It's not open like a studio apartment. Victorians, everything has corridors or separate rooms for everything. And you know when all of those walls and barriers went away? When women got the vote in 1920. Once women got the vote, it was symbolized by the rancher coming into existence, which created dens and open spaces, and the idea of separation of husband and wife and children. Children on the 3rd floor, husbands and wives had separate rooms. That goes away with women getting the vote. But this Victorian house, when you walk into it, originally a Federalist home, but upgraded by them in the interior to a Victorian home. Okay, when you walk in, you're going to see a room, welcome to the David Wills house, and you'll see their pictures. And today it's just a greeting area where the ranger says hello to you and counts you, and you get a stamp. Back then, there was a piano there, and it was a music room. Just like you might have a room where you have a stereo and there's for music and entertainment. That was the music room. How many of you have seen Scrooge? You've seen Scrooge, okay? And so the movie Scrooge, and all right, that's this time period. And so you go, the Victorians didn't invent charades, but they might as well have. They made it popular. They were poking fun at themselves for their manners. They were so intense about manners that charades became a way to poke fun at themselves. But you'd play charades, you would sing. Probably the 3 girls sang in harmony with the mother there with the piano playing. And then, so Lincoln would have gone from the music room into the dining room, would have eaten in the dining room with dignitaries, and then he would have entered into the parlor. Now, we don't have the parlor today set up the way that it would look like back then. We have a film that's playing, and you trigger it when you walk in, it detects motion and starts to play. and it tells you about the National Cemetery and how Wills was centrally involved in planning the cemetery. That is, hiring architects, stonemasons, hiring undertakers, handling the teamsters that would exhume graves from mass graves across the battlefield and take them to the cemetery. He was also involved as an attorney in purchasing the ground that became the National Cemetery. So he was front and center in this whole thing. You can see the parlor that Lincoln would have walked into. Notice when you go into the parlor, there is a marble fireplace. Now, when you go in the other rooms, the mantle is not marble, it's wooden. So the reason for there being a marble fireplace, and Lincoln would have noticed this the moment he walked in with the flickering gas lighting, he would have seen that marble. It's the original one. He would have seen it right away and knew that that screamed rising middle class. Middle class came into existence in the 19th century for the reasons I mentioned earlier. His entrepreneurship allowed him to have a little bit nicer things. And a marble fireplace also would only be in the parlor. Now, the word parlor is still with us today. Funeral parlor, ice cream parlor, pizza parlor. It comes from the 19th century. The parlor was a very formal living room. And you took your guests only really in 2 rooms in your house when they came into the house. You took them either into the parlor or the dining room. Victorians did not take you into their bedroom. They might take you into the music room. Now, that would be another exception. But there was, in some houses, cigar rooms for the men, and brandy rooms for the men, and then knitting and reading rooms, and ladies' relief organization meeting rooms for the women. Husbands and wives did not socialize publicly. Very rarely did they do that before women got the vote. So the rooms reflect this rigid structure between male and female and between class. Now, as you also look at it, we can kind of fill in the gaps of what the furniture looked like. There would have been your finest furniture was in your parlor because it was a chance to show it off to your neighbors. So there may have been a horsehair couch. There's no way to know for sure. We know David Wills died in 1894, 31 years after Lincoln's visit, on the couch, because the newspapers said that he died on the couch. So he would have gone into the parlor and just passed away there. So the parlor is where you have your crystals. It's where you have your family heirlooms. The next room, we know Lincoln was in the dining room. We know he went through the music room. We know that he was in the parlor. We have stories of him being in the parlor. In fact, I'm going to go back. I might lose a second or two, but I'll tell you a story. I took the great-great-great-grandson of David and Catherine Wills through the museum February of 2023. Greg Goodell, the chief curator, said, hey, can you talk to them for a while? I have some things to do. They're here to donate a chair Lincoln sat in, and he said, we're going to eventually figure out a way to display it in the house. It was a chair he sat in while he was here. I said, I'd be honored to take him around. So I went up to them. I said, I go out there to the Wills house usually once a week in the summer and open it up to the public. Can you give me any inside stories? And they did. They told me, they said that when he went in the parlor, he was sitting there and he was talking and apparently had his legs crossed, and the 3 girls were running around the house. You know, the Wills had 3 children. I don't know if they were playing tag or what, but they were running around. And he said the youngest girl kept standing on Lincoln's boot. And, you know, so he just ignored her, and he kept talking to people in the room. And there was 38 people in the house. And there were people looking in the windows to see the president. There was no Secret Service then, so people filed in and just looked at times and things like that. Nobody back then ever got to see the president. Today, you and I, in our lifetime, we've seen many presidents through video and television and internet. Back then, you might see a wood carving sketch in the newspaper, and that was it. So to actually see the president was a special thing. And Lincoln knew that people were looking at him. But so the little girl kept stepping on his boot, and the last time, it was either the second or third time, he lifted his leg and flung her through the air. So in other words, he just flung her like a lift, and she started laughing and she ran. I said, now, how do you know that story? I said to the great-great-grandson. He said, because that was my great-great-grandmother. And that was the story she told. I said, can you tell me any other stories? He said, yeah, James Wills, who was living there. That was the father. He was a widower. He was the president of the bank. I mentioned him earlier. He was David Wills' father. And he was about Lincoln's age, and he was in his mid-50s. And for some reason, he and Lincoln really hit it off. I don't know if it's the same generation, but they were standing over in the corner talking. And at one point, the people that were following through to see the president challenged them. This is from the family now. This is not written anywhere. The family challenged them to a contest on who was taller and got them to stand side by side and put their backs, and they put a straight edge on their head. Lincoln was 6'4". James Wills must have been near that height, and that's why people were enticed. Lincoln was slightly taller, and James Wills took it badly. He said, well, you're wearing your shoes, I'm still wearing my slippers. So these are some of the stories that were passed on. I could tell you more, but Lincoln spent time in the parlor. And then the law office, we don't have any direct evidence of him going into David Wills' law office. But in this law office, Wills would have most likely written to Lincoln the words, it is the desire that after the oration, you as chief executive of this nation should formally set apart these grounds to their sacred use by delivering a few appropriate remarks. That was the invitation for the Gettysburg Address. And Wills also in there, he was a lawyer, so he handled damage claims. Some of you know that. People lost cattle and homes all during the battle. He was their lawyer. He handled wills and marriage license and birth certificates. He was a lawyer. But he also, in that room, you can see the gas lighting. He was responsible, along with a committee, for bringing gas lighting to the home. He also helped bring the Hanover-Gettysburg Railroad to Gettysburg, gave a speech on the Hanover Junction end of 24 miles east of here, and helped cut the ribbon there. So this is one of the reasons why he was chosen to help organize the cleanup after the battle and create the cemetery and invite Lincoln to stay in his home, is because he was a go-getter. You know, there's an old expression, and this is true of my good friend Pam over here. If you want to get something done, find somebody who's busy. And that was David Wills. He would he had his hand in a lot of different things, so it was suggested to the governor, this is who you need to talk to get things done. See the stove over to the right? That's screaming to you. It's screaming to you. Rising middle class, rising middle class, rising middle class. Lincoln would have instantly recognized an insert like stove like that, if not in this room, upstairs. And we're getting ready to get to upstairs where he stayed. But an insert like that. By the way, Craig Cava, who lives here in Gettysburg, owns the original. He's been talking to Greg Goodell about loaning it. This is a replica. And what it does is, it's iron, it foments heat, you build a fire, and then the hot air rises, and it causes the bellows to kick air back out, baffles to kick hot air back out in the room. So it conserves heat. And you'll notice, too, the red walls. Red colors in Victorian homes. Trust me, I've been restoring one for a while now. Red is the color. Each color has meaning to Victorians. And red would indicate community leadership. And he was a community leader. He was on the Firemen's Club. He was on the Science Club at Gettysburg College. He was a graduate of Gettysburg College. And he practiced law also with his son-in-law, a man by the name of Quimby, late in his life in that room. One last social history point, and then we'll pick it up here. I want you to notice the floor covering. Now, this is a floor covering design you could buy at that time. We don't know exactly the floor covering, what it looked like. But there was floor covering in there based on one of the daughter's accounts. She wrote an account many years after the house had changed hands to a newer proprietor in the early 1900s. And she gave specific, her name was Jenny Wills Quimby. It was her husband that was a law partner with David Wills. And she wrote to a later proprietors around 1914, 1915, right in there. He said, hey, I might turn some of the rooms into a museum. I have a pharmacy here. Can you tell me what the rooms look like in case I've turned some of them into a museum? What did they look like when you were a little girl? And so we have those detailed drawings. So we have the ability to restore the rooms to the way they look. And so there was some kind of floor covering in there. Now, what does that tell us? Rising middle class, rising middle class. If you went to a poor dirt farmer's house, they would have had maybe no floor. You came into this house, there was not only a floor, but floor covering, which helped with drafts. So Lincoln would have picked up on this thing. I rather think Lincoln walked in there. We haven't found any smoking gun evidence, but Wills was a lawyer, so was Lincoln. You'd think Wills would have said at some point, hey, come check out my law book. But we don't have any direct evidence. Okay, and then you go to the upstairs, and you do that tomorrow. You can go to the left or right. We've turned some of them into galleries, but there were bedrooms. This is a bedroom on the second floor. We show a film there relating Martin Luther King's speech to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And the family told me a story in February of 2023, the great-great-grandson. He said that night, he said, that's the room where the three girls slept, and they shared a bed. And he said one of the girls turned in the middle of the night, and something was weak about the structure, and the bed collapsed. And it went kaboom. And the girls just started laughing. I said, what did Lincoln do? Because he was staying in Catherine and David Will's room right beside the kids' room. And they said, the family's descendants said, we don't know. Lincoln never opened the door. But he probably put two and two together if he heard the loud kaboom, because he heard the girls laughing right after that. These are just stories. I had a professor that used to say, Troy, take what you need, discard what you don't need. I never know when I'm going to tell a story that somebody remembers that I hadn't planned to say. All right, and then another parlor. You're really well off if you have two parlors. They sometimes call, this is on the second floor, this particular parlor could also be called the drawing room, the sitting room, or the morning room. And I asked the great-great-grandson what they called it. He said that his great-grandparents called it the sitting room. And that's a room where you sit for a few minutes before you go to bed. There's one outside the bedroom at the White House where the president, first lady sleep. And it's also where you sit when you wake up before you go downstairs. Maybe someone brings you a cup of tea. It's called a morning room because it's where the sun comes in. This is all refineries that come with rising middle class. Lincoln would have been in that parlor. He had to go through that parlor because it led right into the room you're about to see where he slept. So sitting room, drawing room. They use the term drawing room in Victorian times too. I'm discussing Victorian culture so you can see the culture. Just if there's anybody here that's a child of the 90s, you know about Mario, and you know about Ben Affleck, and you know about Matt Damon, and you know about there's music of that time period, Pearl Jam, and all the various groups that grunge music. All right, I'm describing to you the culture Lincoln lived in, and so he would have recognized it all around him. The blue reinforces trust, and you want guests to feel trust and safety when they walk into a room, so it's light blue. But drawing room comes from the idea of no one drew in there. It means it's a place to withdraw to have a private conversation. And today there are no doors on many of these rooms. That's so we can have free flow of traffic. But you had to have doors then to keep the heat in each room. So there's a fireplace in each room. And then we have, that's the drawing room again. And then you enter into the bedroom. This was David and Catherine's bedroom. And it's the exact bed that Lincoln slept in. It's a Rococo bed, which was really luxuriant. That's some of the most expensive. It was bought in Maryland. And we have the certificates for where it was bought from in Maryland. It would have only arrived here by train. Remember, part of my theme here is talking about how this is life in a northern town. Trains allowed remote places to suddenly receive things from New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Someone living in the hinterland this far inland would never have access to these things unless you had access to a train. There were catalogs that looked like a Sears catalog. Some of you are old enough to remember that, where you could order floor covering, curtains, a wood stove. You and I think today how quaint a Dutch oven is, a curved stove that's big enough to walk in and hang a pot and so forth. Oh, that was outdated. If you had that back then, you were poor. In the 1860s, you had to have a wood stove, which came here by rail from Philly or Baltimore. And the Wills had all of those things. People's houses were full of goods made in coastal port cities along the Northeast because of the railroad. Wills had to work really hard to get the railroad to come through here. Hunterstown got left out, hung out to dry. Gettysburg ended up on the line thanks to Wills and others arguing to connect. That's like having internet in your home today, so you can order things through Amazon. So the bedspread's the original. The table and the chair are the original, where he finished writing the Gettysburg Address, and so is the vanity and mirror, where he likely adjusted his tie and his hat. I asked the grandson, great-great-grandson, I said, how can I know those things are original? He said, because, and he put his arm around his wife, he says, because we donated them. And he said, the kids, they don't disrespect the furniture, but our kids have no use for this furniture, and that's why we're starting to donate it to you all now. So more and more things are coming in. You'll start to see the house look more and more like it did when Lincoln visited. I'm sure over time there'll be a plan on how to display these original artifacts coming to us from Will's descendants who live in Connecticut. And there's another angle. That rocking chair and bureau on the floor, bureau is a foot warmer. Those two items are not original to the room, they're original to the house. Everything else in that room is original to that room. And there's an artist's depiction of Lincoln completing the Gettysburg Address the night before he gave it. Life in a mid-19th century northern Pennsylvania town is characterized by the following. A town square. You all know that. I'm sure you all know that. You can't grow up in Pennsylvania and go to school here without hearing about William Penn and Thomas Penn and the town square. It's an English idea. You've heard of Rittenhouse Square, have you, in Philadelphia? You've heard of, well, let's go back to Europe. Have you heard of Piccadilly Square and Trafalgar Square? And there's squares in other parts of the world. There's Red Square in Moscow, and there's Tiananmen Square in China. Squares are areas, they were square. Today it's turned into a traffic circle because of the automobile. But the squares allowed horse-drawn carriages to park more flush against the curb because they were squares. Squares are also a meeting point for all the roads where commerce is done. The Wills were then at the head of the classroom by being at the center of the town square where all the roads come together. There were firemen's bake sales there. We have accounts of that. We have marching bands playing there. We have troops arriving by train and performing plays there. The train brought so many things, political speeches and debates. If you were on this town really benefited from the train. There's the train system, train station in Gettysburg that Lincoln would have, this is the train station that he arrived on. You go there today, you put goggles on when you walk in, and you can see things in 3 dimensions. And someone told me the Titanic exhibit is the best when you actually can put your hands out and it's virtual reality and you feel like you can see the lifeboats. Maybe this one's not that sophisticated, but go in there and check out those virtual reality glasses. But Lincoln would have arrived there, and there was a Marine band playing. There were politicians, 6 current governors, 2 former governors, women and children and men all standing around waiting for him to arrive. Probably around 6:30, maybe as early as 6:15, November 18th, 1863, 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. But the train station would have been common to modern towns throughout the North, not only because of the advent of the railroad, but because of the American system. Henry Clay pushed through the idea of an American system. It was a vision for the country introduced in the 1830s. It was build American, buy American. High tariffs on Southern imports. That tariff money was used to build infrastructure, north and south. Invest in railroads, canals, macadamized roads, telegraph. The Whig Party embraced that idea. Lincoln was a Whig. Don't think for a minute he didn't recognize that modernization all around him. He was in the party that was pushing that idea of less of a sort of a rural appearance and more of a modern appearance. So there was a telegraph system. The telegraph revolutionized things. It created the stock market. Knowledge is power. You could be living in New York and somebody telegraph you from Chicago and say, hey, there was a particularly good grain crop here this year. Really good, way more than you need. And then you get that information way ahead of anybody else. It only takes 3 minutes for that transmission to take place from Chicago to New York. and you take sight unseen that information, and you buy great quantities of that grain, and then you sell it in shares for a profit. You get rich. It's called the stock exchange. The telegraph also allowed quick communications for newspapers. You didn't have the Associated Press, but you had similar articles all across the country in major cities because it could be sent quickly by the telegraph. So the telegraph was important. The telegraph was used to find people here wounded, beds in Philadelphia, New York, Washington, and then put them on a rail car. Gettysburg is one of the first battles in the Civil War, is the first war in history where the rail is used extensively to remove wounded from the battlefield. In every war in previous century, the wounded either recovered or died within 4 miles of where they fell. The rail was taking wounded out of here to where they could get a better ratio of help to need. Instead of 900 patients to one surgeon here, which this area was overtaxed for everything, including water, you could send someone through telegraph communications to a bed in Philly where the ratio was 1 surgeon per 12 patients and a real bed. So communications, tremendous. There was a telegraph message sent from Boston to San Francisco during the gold rush in 1850. Get ready for this. The communication went out from Boston to San Francisco and back in 5 minutes. That trip used to take 14 weeks round trip by horse and buggy. And they had no Panama Canal, so it was no quicker with a ship from Atlantic to Pacific. You had to go around the southern tip of South America and Magellan Strait. So what had been 14 weeks suddenly could be done in 5 minutes in the way of communication. No wonder the idea of nationalism starts to become more and more prominent on the eve of the Civil War. You can actually control from a central government a place 3,000 miles away in 5 minutes communication. So telegraph is called the first transportation communication revolution. The American system is first created by Henry Clay. Okay, macadamized roads is part of the American system, and the development of infrastructure. Lincoln, as a former Whig, would have recognized right away, oh, this town is a byproduct of modernization, of infrastructure. Did you know Gettysburg had 10 roads here, and several of them are true macadamized roads. At least 3 of them were, with thick layers of gravel. It keeps mud from forming and wheels disappearing and entire wagons disappearing in the mud during the rainy season. Okay, the Lutheran Theological Seminary is a byproduct of the town being modern. It's the oldest Lutheran seminary in the country. You're on Seminary Ridge. This is Seminary Ridge. You follow it north just a little ways, you run into the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Founded in 1828, 35 years old during the battle, the oldest seminary in the country. They have a great museum if you want to tour through there. So Lincoln would have noticed, hey, this is modernization. This is the American system at work. There was a college here, the Pennsylvania College, which we call Gettysburg College today. For a town this size to have a seminary and a college, that's quite impressive. Macadamized roads. And then there were brick kilns. There was a battle fought on Coster Avenue in town on the first day of the battle, and there's this beautiful mural painted on the side of the barn. Walk down, everybody knows about the cyclorama, but few people know about this mural. When you're in the town square, walk a couple blocks in the direction of Water Street, and then you'll see a by-street called Coster Avenue, and there's this magnificent painting on the side of the wall, and you'll see the Union soldiers there, the 154th New York and fighting North Carolinians on the first day of the battle in front of these honeycomb-shaped brick kilns. Did you know there were a lot of brick buildings in Gettysburg? That's consciousness of fire prevention. Okay, and so that's modernity. Lincoln would have noticed those things right away. And then there were mills. There was McAllister Mill. There was McAllister Mill's on Rock Creek. And there was also Brames Mill. And some people know that Tawnytown Road was also called Horner's Mill Road because there was Horner's Mill at what's now a town called Barlow, just south of Gettysburg. There's a fire hall there today. So there were mills that would use water power and these huge stone grist disc. They would grind up granules of wheat into flour, and you bag the flour, and grind up granules of corn to make cornmeal. You get your news there and your gossip there, and the town was not Philadelphia, but there was a lot of modern aspects to this town. And then there's the Rough House Tannery. Notice the smokestack off to the right. That's a picture of modernization Lincoln would have noticed. And the townspeople would have been proud of. Why do you have smokestacks? To put the soot and the uncleanliness way above the street so people are not smelling it at street level. And then nearby you had Thaddeus Stevens, the famous abolitionist, Caledonia Furnace. In fact, the railroad here in town was originally attempted to be extended in 1838 west of Gettysburg. It went bankrupt in 1837-38 and wasn't completed until the Western Maryland Railroad completed it in the 1880s out towards Hancock, Maryland. But Thaddeus Stevens wanted to connect Gettysburg to his furnaces where he was producing iron. In 1860, 600 plus iron furnaces were in Pennsylvania. Did you all know that? 600. You've heard of Hopewell Furnace? There's a lot of furnaces around here. Mariah Furnace, and there's Mont Alto Furnace. And in there, the ovens would heat so much it would separate the impurities. You'd take ore out of the ground, mine it out of the ground, and it was a whole system with lime being used to create these incredible temperatures. And then it would drip out like liquid into these what are called pig casts. And then you would create pig iron. And they're just basically sand cast. And you'd sell that. People would make it into nails and to rims for their wheels and for hinges for their doors. That's very, very modern. That's very modern. And by the way, Thaddeus Stevens would have been disliked in the South in part because he wanted high tariffs on the South so that people would not buy iron from England through ports in Savannah and Charleston, that it would be too expensive to buy imported iron, that he would buy iron from Thaddeus Stevens in the North. So modernization in the North was really taking over. The anthracite coal mines, I didn't mention that, but the Confederates were very interested in that when they came into Pennsylvania. The North was modernizing. Lincoln recognized that. He was a Whig. He would have seen that as part of an extension of his party's work. Now, Lincoln addressed the people at Hanover Junction, 24 miles east of here, the day before his speech on his way to Gettysburg. And there's an artist's depiction of it. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's a Mort Kunstler painting of Lincoln arriving in Gettysburg that evening, probably around 6:30. Notice it's getting dusky. You see the crowds in this modern town all around him. And then here's Dale Gallen's famous painting of the people of Lincoln walking from the train station towards the David and Catherine Wills house, and the crowds are gathered all around him. Notice the men are wearing top hats and tuxedos. I don't have time to get into this tonight. It would be a side venture. We can talk about it during Q&A. But Gothic revival was very popular in the 19th century. Some of you heard me say that before. But there was a jail here in the town that looked like a castle. West Point looked like a castle. The National Cathedral, built in the mid-19th century, looks like a medieval castle. Big Ben, built in the mid-19th century, looks like a, not castle, but cathedral, a medieval cathedral. Now, why would you build Gothic revival in the middle of the 19th century? 19th century people were very interested in the Middle Ages. And the idea of a knight in shining armor and the chivalric code came back as the Victorian code. I could go on and on about that. But dark clothing became popular as an extension of that. In fact, one of the reasons that men wore taller and taller and taller hats is that was the only variation in their formal dress wardrobe, because they always wore dark colors. Now, here's your Roman grid, and we're going to go real quickly through some of the townspeople. I'm going to go through this. Sometimes when I look at the clock and I see I'm not going to get through all of them, I speed it up. But let's go through some of the townspeople that were in that crowd. Let's identify some of the people in these crowds. We've been talking about a modern town. Now let's look at the people, not just the technology, but the people themselves. Okay, there was John Burns. You all know that he was in his early 70s. And he walked with his own musket out to McPherson Ridge to participate in the battle and fought with the Wisconsin soldiers. When Lincoln came to visit, you all may know after his Gettysburg Address, he didn't just get back on the train and go straight back to Washington, which is a 5-hour ride. He actually walked down to a political meeting in the Presbyterian Church, in part because he heard John Burns was there, and he wanted to see this 70-some-year-old man that had picked up his musket and fought alongside the Iron Brigade on the first day of the battle. We're moving along real quick here now. That's the John Burns house. This is Mary Thompson. She raised 8 children. That alone is a massive accomplishment in life. I helped raise 1 son, and I take my hat off to her. But she's known nationally. She's known nationally for having Robert E. Lee stay in her house. Maybe. She denied that after the battle because she took so much criticism for the enemy staying in her house. He may have stayed in a tent outside her house and then walked in and out of her house periodically. This is the Mary Thompson house. You can visit it today. The Battlefield Trust keeps it open on a semi-regular basis. And then Mary McAllister. She lived right across from Christ Lutheran Church. The Gettysburg is right there, too. A really good restaurant. And so is Mama V's, an excellent Italian restaurant. But Mary McAllister came out of her house. She went across the street, and she remembers a boy having 7 fingers cut off. She saw all of them fall down. She also, if you look there, she had quite an encounter with Colonel Henry Morrow, 24th Michigan Iron Brigade, and Dennis B. Daly's 2nd Wisconsin and General James Archer's sword. Apparently, she was given a sword and she hid it under her dress, and then it was later returned. She's the one, too, I should say this, that she had trouble crossing the street. Let me elaborate on that briefly. She's the one, you may have heard this in documentaries, that said it was so difficult to walk across Chambersburg Street at the end of the first day of the battle as Union troops were filing through the streets and through the towns back to Cemetery Hill. She said it was like entering into a river, and then you're just carried downstream. And then you finally get to the opposite bank, but you're a good half-mile or a mile. That's how she described the flood of Union soldiers going through the streets at the end of the first day of the battle. She took a step into the street, and then you had to just keep moving laterally before she finally got across the street to help care for wounded in the church, the Christ Lutheran Church. And this is Sally Broadhead. She lived on Chambersburg Street. She was a teacher and author of Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg. There's Professor Michael Jacobs. He was given a lecture at Gettysburg College on the first day of the battle when the cannons were booming. And his students opened the window, and they kept standing up and looking at all the loud noises in the battle, and he was trying to lecture. And he finally said, "All right, class is dismissed. You all are not listening anyway." I always wondered why he was still having the lecture. I mean, that takes a lot of guts. But he apparently took the telescope, what we would call a telescope, from the school and took it home and put it up on the roof of his house, and he observed Pickett's charge on the 3rd day of the battle. He told his son, Jacob, who was, as I remember, he was in his teens at that time. He said, "Come quickly, Jacob, look into the scope. You're about to see something you'll never forget." And as an older man, Jacob wrote, he said, "I looked into it just in time to see Pickett's troops swinging around." That would be a left oblique. Daniel Skelly, he was a dry goods clerk in Farnsworth Brothers firm. That would be, it's a law office today. It's just a couple of doors down from the town square. It's real near the courthouse. And we know that General Oliver O'Howard went up there on top of that Farnstock dry goods building and used it as a line of sight on the first day of the battle. Came back, took a picture there many years later. There's so many good stories there. He and 2 friends used a handcart to travel from Hanover toward Gettysburg on June 27th. Had to walk the remaining 10 miles from a burned bridge at Conewago Creek. Confederates burned 22 bridges between here and Hanover Junction. Try to rip out Union rails so they wouldn't have modern transportation during the battle, bring in supplies, weapons, horses, medical equipment. That was deliberate. The Power Sisters, the famous Power Sisters. There were 5 of them that you see in the picture. And a few years ago, someone here, I used to coordinate the Wall of Faces. These are pictures that were up on the wall in the old visitor center. So maybe some of you are old enough to remember that. And I did that for like 8 or 9 years, and people would donate photographs, and I'd work with a silk screener to put together a plaque and put them up on the wall. And we'd have the families and descendants come in and take a picture for the newspaper. And a woman contacted me one day, and she said, I have a picture of a 6th power sister that no one knows about. She sent it to me, and it's in the collection. But this is a famous one of the Power Sisters. They lived on the northeast corner of South Washington and High Street, and they cared for wounded in a cold, let's put it this way, a wet, very damp cellar. And it was a sickly place. They cared for over 20 wounded there. This is Sally Myers. She was a school teacher since age 16. Now, she went into the St. Francis Xavier Church, it's the Catholic Church. She was squeamish, but she was brave enough to say, I'll help. She got used to it. I guess as much used to it as you can, seeing all the suffering. And one of the stories involving Sally Myers was Sergeant Alexander Stewart, 149th Pennsylvania, was shot through the lungs, legs, paralyzed, and died in Sally's care in the Catholic Church on July 6th. Before Alexander died, Sally read a Bible chapter to him that his father had read before he left. His father retrieved the body 6 weeks later. That's Stewart's body. The father, mother, and other son, Henry, returned a year later. Sally and Henry fell in love and married in 1867. So the man she had treated, who died on July 6th of his wound, she married his brother, and then she was pregnant, and then their son was born a month after his death. So she lost two of the same family that she loved and had a son. And there's her house there on West High Street. So these are some of the people in the crowd. I'm trying to add a human touch to the idea of modernization and Victorian culture. There's St. Francis Church. She cared for the wounded. The beautiful stained glass window in there. You might want to enter just to look at that. And Jenny Wade, everybody knows about Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed outright during the battle from a bullet that flew through from a sharpshooter while she was caring for her sister Georgia and her infant. She had just delivered a child, and so Virginia Wade was there caring for her when she was tragically killed. These are stories you can go to houses and witness tomorrow. That is, you can at least look in the windows, or in some cases enter the building if they're open to the public. John Jack Hopkins lived on South Washington Street. He was an employee of Gettysburg College. And he and his family fled the campus home, which was ransacked. We know that, according to Tilly Pierce, who was 15 years old, she wrote a book called What a Girl Saw at Gettysburg. She wrote this as an older woman. She said the African-American population, close to, she said 140, we think maybe upwards of 200, fled to the caves of Sheep's Haven in Wolf Hill, 4 miles east of Cemetery Ridge. So that's where they went. And then the black population had to leave further once the Confederate Army got here. They went to Harrisburg, for instance, to help build entrenchments around the city there. Okay, so there's a wonderful African-American story here of how they owned houses on the battlefield. And now this is Tilly Pierce. I already mentioned her. She's the girl that saw, heard the battle. Okay, and there's the Tilly Pierce house. It's a B&B. I know a guy who works in there, and he said when the rooms are empty, he lets visitors come off the street and he shows them the rooms. They're original, they're the original rooms that Tilly lived in. And then the George and Hetty Shriver house. There were 2 children, Sadie, who was 5, and Molly, who was 3 years old. That house is beautifully restored, probably the best restored Victorian home in Gettysburg. It's open to the public, and you can visit that. And then there's Anna Garlick Kitzmiller. Her father actually owned a cabinet shop right there on Baltimore Street. They made caskets, cabinets, all kinds of wood things, tables, chester drawers. And then there was Josephine Rogers Miller, who cooked for the 1st Massachusetts Infantry, and she came back years later. They paid for her train ride, roughly 25 years later. her train fare to her reunion, and she took a picture on the battlefield. They wanted to thank her for her hospitality. And the best hospitality person I've ever met is Pam Neal over here, my colleague over here to my left. I can't tell you how many parties she's planned for people over the years. Unbelievable. Now, you can see here, Peter and Catherine Massor-Thorne, they were the caretakers of the Evergreen Cemetery, the town cemetery. Lincoln technically spoke in the Evergreen Cemetery because the National Cemetery, what would become the National Cemetery, was a construction site, so the crowds were kept away from it. But she had to take care of the cemetery herself. Her husband, Peter, was in Washington, D.C. at that time in the labyrinth of earthworks around the city. He wasn't in this battle, but he was in the Union Army, not here. He was 95 miles away. She was several months pregnant and had to help. She oversaw the burial of over 100 soldiers. Probably 40 of them she was physically directly involved in burying them. She said that in the later years she just wasn't right on the inside. It did something to her. There's the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, and we're getting down to the very end here. A couple more civilians, and then we'll get to Lincoln's address and pull it all together. This is Henry Stahl. He owned the Democratic Compiler. That was a newspaper in town. And there's David Wills. We talked about him at length earlier. This is Mary and Basil Jackson Biggs. The Biggs family not only was Basil Biggs heavily involved as a teamster in transferring a lot of the bodies. He helped exhume bodies, helped identify them, along with Samuel Weaver, and they moved the bodies over to the National Cemetery. Something like 30 to 100 bodies a day were being moved. This was going on from October of 1863 well into May of 1864. When Lincoln got here, maybe a quarter of the graves in the National Cemetery, what would come to be called the National Cemetery later, maybe a quarter of the graves were full. Most of the soldiers were still in mass graves. But Wills wanted to have the ceremony to dedicate the cemetery before the winter set in, the same year as the battle. Even though it was a construction site, we're going to pause for a day. We're going to cover the open graves with tarps that we've been digging. We're going to leave the caskets where they are. We're going to tie up the axe and picks and shovels and bundles, and we're going to have a ceremony and dedicate. And we're going to do that, and then we'll continue working after the ceremony's over. Biggs was heavily involved in that. This is Dr. J.W.C. O'Neill. He went to Gettysburg College. He was originally from Fairfax, Virginia, went back to Fairfax, Virginia, then started practicing medicine in Baltimore, Maryland, got homesick for his college town, and moved back here. And as fate would have it, he was here. He was sympathetic to the Virginians because he was originally from Virginia, and he went around and helped mark a number of the Confederate graves with maps. Maps that a ladies' relief organization in the South used to locate Southern mass graves 8, 9, 10 years later. And a person who helped out in this was Rufus Weaver. He taught at the anatomy school at Gettysburg College. He mostly dealt with animal bones, but he looked at the skeletal remains of 2,935 Confederates to identify, yes, this is a human femur, this is not an animal femur. Yes, this is probably a 19-year-old man, as the rolls would indicate. So he gave as much certainty as you could give to identifying bodies before they were relocated by train. Southerners were relocated 8, 9, 10 years after the battle from mass graves to Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, and Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery. This is Solomon Powers. He ran a quarry. He had a quarry on the northeast corner of South Washington and High Street. You saw his 5 daughters earlier, the Powers sisters. He also owned Powers Hill before the war. You ever heard of Powers Hill? He had a quarry up there too. So I wanted you to see some of the names and the faces in the crowd that are the physical representation of this Victorian culture that Lincoln recognized. And then there's Charles Tyson. We said he rented a photography studio in the Tyson Wills house, which is now a malt shop today. And another face in the crowd would be Sadie Bushman Jungerman, and she cared for wounded here. She was pressed into service by an Army doctor. It's a famous story. She moved out west like so many other people for a fresh start after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. A lot of people moved out west, or they went out in bonanzas, caravans, and she went out to San Francisco, and she published her story in the San Francisco Bulletin of how, as a girl, she helped care for the wounded at Gettysburg. And the medical doctor who had pressed her into service was living there too at the time and read the article, and they got together for dinner. This is years later. So many neat stories. Take a town tour. Debbie, you were on that town tour we took downtown earlier. Brad Godfrey took us around on a town tour. He gave us almost a 3-hour tour. We were just in heaven the whole time. Story after story after story after story. And this is Reverend Amos Moser Wetston. He was a Lutheran seminary student. He was later the director of the seminary. He's in that crowd. Now, this is the town square where everyone gathered before they marched in a funeral procession down Baltimore Street to the cemetery to dedicate what eventually became one of the first national cemeteries. So you'd have seen, as I try to paint a picture here in the town square, you can see the Wills house is painted the wrong color. It's gray. It would have been red at that time. And you can see the flag at half-staff. That's probably an artist license there. I don't know that it was half-staff. It might have been. But you would have seen the Masons there, dressed in their tuxedos, the Baltimore Glee Club there to sing in 4-part harmony, the 9th Heavy Artillery, which had a contingent of artillery, cavalry, and infantry, and they had a band. And there's a lady that periodically visits me here. Her ancestor was in that band. She's really proud of it, and she's in a band today. She's actually a band teacher, and it goes back to that inspiration. But you would have seen, you'd have seen the sun reflecting off of brass instruments. Lincoln was there with the dignitaries. The Secretary of State was there, and the former president of Harvard. And this is the town square, and they would have proceeded right down that street, Baltimore Street. On your right is another home owned by the Moses McLean family. They own the more famous Moses McLean barn out near the Peace Light. And you would have seen a funeral procession. 19th century people borrowed heavily from the idea of the medieval pilgrimage. Have you ever heard of a pilgrimage? That's what the Crusades were originally called. Did you know a lot of people that didn't have any weapons just followed the knights because they saw it as sort of a holy pilgrimage? We might consider it a holiday or a vacation today, and followed them. It turned out to be anything but that, but they followed them all the way from France to the Holy Land. And the pilgrimage was something very common in the 19th century. Pilgrimage, you take a pilgrimage for 2 reasons: to learn about an event, and 2, to learn something about yourself. I tell visitors that daily when we go on pilgrimages across the battlefield. But that idea of a pilgrimage, academic historians say, recycled in 19th century Victorian culture in the form of funeral processions. They had grand funeral processions in the 19th century. Even as late as McKinley's assassination, it was a grand. Some of you have seen John F. Kennedy's funeral, and everyone wearing black, and this goes back to the funeral procession of the 19th century. Almost charades ties into this too. The idea that they were very outward and very grand in the things that they did. A lot of pageantry. And so you can see them walking up Baltimore Street and past that stovepipe of tannery. There's the 9th Heavy Artillery. Hopefully I'm helping you feel like you're there. And there's an artist's rendition of Lincoln tipping his hat, and the dignitaries around him. The Secretary of State is there, former president of Harvard, 6 current governors, 2 former governors, a French ambassador, and also one from Italy who came by train. And then the cemetery itself, it wasn't this pristine and well-designed, but eventually it would be. It was designed, some would say, to look like the federal elliptical fan that I showed you above the door earlier. In other words, it's screaming to us federalism. Federalism. Originally, the designer, William Saunders, wanted to do away with separate plots. There's 18 separate states that were funded or burial committees were sent from 18 states to create 18 separate sections to represent 18 states. The original designer, William Saunders, wanted to do away with those partitions and just bury everyone side by side, regardless of rank, regardless of state. But the states insisted on that separation. That's more of a federalism. That's a deeper point I wanted to insert there for you to think on. And then there's Lincoln in the crowd sitting down, probably after he had just finished the speech. You can see his hair is a little matted from wearing his hat during the day. You can see his bodyguard, Ward Layman, in the foreground, a huge man that you didn't want to mess with, walking in front of him. And then Lincoln captures the moment at Gettysburg by talking about how the Union died at Gettysburg and the nation was born at Gettysburg. He's the first president in American history, with the Gettysburg Address, the first speech in American history by a president in American history to refer to the United States as a nation. In his inaugural speech 2 years earlier, he referred over 20 times to the country as a union. The Northern Army was called the Union Army. Union is implied like European Union, separate countries, separate states, and that those separate states and those separate countries come together for commerce, trade, mutual military support. The transportation communication revolution had made the world a lot smaller. So it was now time. Lincoln declared Gettysburg's importance as being the moment where the country became a nation. That this nation, under God, they were founders turning metaphorically over in their grave when he said the word nation. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in, what did he say? He said nation. Now we're conceived in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any such nation. He said nation. He said union 2 years ago. Where did nation come from? He saw Gettysburg as the moment where the nation was born. There's much more I can tell you about that, but I want you to see that that's the essence. Language and rhetoric are key elements of studying in the past. Presidents seize moments to define the importance of something, and that's what he did. So, in conclusion, then, Lincoln speaks in the language of modernism, Victorian culture, and nationalism. He brings all of those things into his speech. And the Soldiers' National Monument, this is one of the first national, we use the word nation all the time today. National monuments, national cemeteries, national parks, national health care, national public radio, national weather service, national football. No one used the word nation or national before the Gettysburg Address. And so we went from being a union to a nation during the Civil War. And that was going on all around the world, too, at the same time, thanks to transportation and communication, you strap iron in every direction, and you can make places that have been remote for centuries suddenly connected within 5 minutes communication. Okay, and I basically repeat the same thing in my conclusion. So I want to thank you tonight for coming out. This is, I thought, well, should I say this or not? I don't mean anything negative about it, but I really want to tell you that I've been doing this for over 40 years in national parks, and this is my last Campfire program, and it's a pleasure to be able to present it to you tonight. Thank you. And I did that not for an applause, but because I just wanted to say it. It's just like I couldn't keep it in. So anyway, I'll be here for a little while if you have any further questions, and I'll be around to follow up if you want to talk a little bit further. I'm going to turn on the lamps. So if you have quite no one left, the worst thing you could do, is to stay around, because Rangers look for excuses to keep talking. We do. We try to find another excuse, and finally people say, okay, I got lunch now, I got to go. So, but if anybody has a question, just blurt it out. Yes, okay, I see a hand over there, so if you want to go ahead. Nope, did you want to ask? Okay, you had a question, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I heard that Mr. Lincoln and his valet had or got smallpox when they came here. Can you elaborate on that?
That's good. Yeah, Willie, who was his valet, was his barber, who was with him all the time, an African American who was with him. In fact, Willie left Lincoln several times, at least twice that we know of. From Will's later, he did a sworn testimony and got it notarized. He said that Willie left Lincoln's room twice to David Wills to come out and find David Wills and ask him questions, and once to see the Secretary of State. Now, they had, it's usually believed, some mild variant of smallpox. We do know that Lincoln had some form of pox because John Nicolai and John Hay, two of his staff officers, said that Lincoln had the pox here. So he was very pale, clammy. I also believe it could be, and I know these viruses are all closely related, but I've always thought it's possible that he had shingles, because pox break out on you that way because of the intense pressure he was under. You know, at this stage of the war, according to more liberal estimates, there were maybe as many as 320,000 Americans dead by this stage of the war. And before the war was over, the higher estimates are 700 to 20,000 dead in 4 years, largely under one term of one presidency. That's why we're still studying it. We're still coming back to these places, we're still taken back, and there's something about us that wants to go back and study how this happened. But even today, all the wars America's fought in combined, American Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, First War in the Gulf, and the more recent wars in the Middle East, still has not eclipsed that 720,000. So that kind of pressure when you're president. Shelby Foote said that Lincoln was like a Civil War soldier with gray pants to represent the South and a blue coat to represent the North, and was shot by both sides. So even though he was clearly loyal to the United States, Shelby Foote's point was that the circle of trust got smaller and smaller from here. There were fewer and fewer people he could trust, and both sides were taking shots at him, metaphorically speaking. And it got to a point where he was just talking to Mary Todd all the time, unloading on her because, again, the circle of trust. Who can you trust? No wonder people criticized her for having to go to an asylum and having emotional problems. You would too if you had to hear that every day. So she was very upset. To get to more directly to your question, she was very upset that Lincoln came here because Willie, their youngest son, Willie had died a year earlier, and Tad, their youngest son, was ill, and so that caused those fears to come back again very strong. But Lincoln couldn't afford not to be here. The election would start in February. This speech was given in November. He had to be here. So, and he wanted to be here, but politically he had to be here. So there was no latitude there. You all may know that Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln exhumed Willie's body 3 times in the year leading up to Gettysburg just to observe it. They had him embalmed, and so they continued to. That gives you a picture into the kind of pressure he was under. So those are the kind of pressures that would produce illness, weaken your immunity, something like shingles. He must have felt like he was going into orbit when he sat on those chairs that you see in the museum. They're not very comfortable chairs. But yes, any other questions? Yes.
You talked a lot about David Wills. There was another David in town, David McConaughey.
Yeah.
Who seems to have been somewhat of a rival.
Absolutely.
If you can comment on that.
Yeah, David McConaughey was a rival. They didn't really speak. McConaughey was on the board of trustees for a railroad. I think it was the Pennsylvania Railroad, and you know that he also was the caretaker and overseer of the Evergreen Cemetery. That is, he owned land, and he was the overarching proprietor there. He owned what we call East Cemetery Hill too. He wanted to make that, at least early on, that was one of the options of a place to bury the dead, would be what we call East Cemetery Hill today. He was lobbying for that to become the site of the cemetery. So, yeah, they were absolutely rivals. So, yes, another question. Yes, back here in the back. Paul, go ahead. 1855 was when it was completed, about eight years before the battle. And Peter and Catherine Thorne, they came over to the New World about that time, too, from Germany. So they were recent immigrants to the country. Yes, a question over here.
Did Lincoln tour the battlefield?
You know, not an extensive tour. Somebody might have pointed some things out from a distance. I do know for certain that Ed Everett, the keynote speaker, former Secretary of State, Senator from Massachusetts, former President of Harvard, he went on a tour with a Union officer the morning of the speech. In fact, he arrived 30 minutes late, and the procession started at 10:30 instead of 10 o'clock. The funeral procession from the town square to the cemetery, because of him being on a tour. He was very meticulous about gathering information, and someone offered him some more insight. I don't recall Lincoln being given a tour now, but you did just jog my memory on the people of, when he stopped at Hanover Junction, they had to trade his bags from the Northern Central line, later known as the Pennsylvania Railroad, to the Hanover-Gettysburg line. And when they traded his bags over, you'd have had carters carrying the bags over. Some local people talked to Lincoln. He must have stepped outside the train, or maybe to the caboose, and there was a railing there. And local people told him about the cavalry battle in Hanover, involving George Armstrong Custer and Alon Farnsworth and Wade Hampton. Lincoln listened to the explanation. So at least there, some of this battle would have been relayed to him. You also remind me too that the train, he took 3 different rail lines: the Baltimore and Ohio rail line from Washington to Relay Station just outside of Baltimore. They had to stop and change over his bags onto the Northern Central line, and he took that north to Hanover Junction. They traded over his bags again one more time to the Hanover-Gettysburg line, and then he came into Gettysburg. So his bags were changed up 3 times. And the reason for that is standard gauge for rail lines hadn't been set yet. That wouldn't be until the 1880s. It's because the train companies, the Northern Central, the B&O, and these lines, they didn't want to integrate with the same gauge and merge. They didn't want to merge. They wanted you to ride their section of line that they owned, and then they wanted you to unpack and get on another line in a particular city, and there would be jobs for the people in that city packing and unpacking. You would have to also sometimes stay overnight in a hotel there, and maybe eat in a restaurant there. So not connecting the rail lines fed business into the places where the rail lines were in proximity. So Lincoln had to 3 times be transferred. And again, that gave work to people there in the town, and the companies held on to their own identities that way. But the idea of standard gauge comes in the 1880s. And then also at that time, you have by the 1880s, you have time zones. Because of some horrific train wrecks, there had to be more of a synchronicity, and the federal government got involved. The states more closely got involved in merging the railroads and making everything standard. Now, on one section of the trip, Lincoln rode in a car that was dressed with red, white, and blue to try to paint the picture. So there were banners inside of it. And the Baltimore Glee Club sang patriotic tunes to him. So he would have been put in the mood or acclimated on the way here on this train ride. And of course, it took, even with the 3 different rail lines, it took him 5 hours to get here. Which some people who survived Washington D.C. Beltway traffic are still impressed by. So yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yes, Bob.
Troy, did you say, by the way, thank you, congratulations,
Thank
40
you.
years.
Thank you.
Huzzah.
Thank you very much.
Did you say the tuxedo was a Victorian Gothic thing?
It was. Have you ever seen The Munsters or the Addams Family?
Okay.
That pokes fun at Victorian obsession with Gothic revival.
Okay.
Yeah, they were very much into the Middle Ages. Some of you know, I've said this before to a couple of you, that Mark Twain famously wrote that Sir Walter Scott, he blamed him for causing the Civil War because of his romantic Waverly Diaries. You've read this. Romantic meaning the idea of chivalry and this idea of the Middle Ages and Rapunzel letting down her long hair and that kind of thing. He said that those Waverly Diaries, which are part of the Romantic movement, influenced a lot of planters in the South to imagine themselves as lords of manor. And they created this caste system where there's serfs and peasants and slaves and knights in shining armor. And it gave sort of a militaristic template that Mark Twain believed Sir Walter Scott, as a writer, influenced the South in the way that they viewed themselves. And if you go back and look at, just look up his quote tonight, Mark Twain's quote, he writes it in a serious way. It's a hard edge to it. But the whole idea of the Middle Ages recycling, how many of you know in the 19th century there was this interest in Scotland of seeing the Loch Ness Monster? That became a real thing in the 1800s. Well, that's a throwback to dragons and fire-breathing dragons. And there was this, if you look at West Point, it looks like a castle. You go to college campuses, and the oldest buildings that are built in the middle 1800s look like medieval castles. You think, what are they doing this for? It's because it was in vogue. The Middle Ages, this is what memory does. It takes a really bad time in history and puts a nostalgic twist on it. The reason for the Middle Ages becoming kind of popular was because of the Enlightenment and industrialization. The Enlightenment in the 1600s introduced logic and reason to the extreme. You had political science. That's part of the Enlightenment. Political science, it comes out of the writings of Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and Machiavelli and Diderot and Hume and Montesquieu, the idea of three branches of government, a bicameral system, representative government, that each of the branches counterbalance each other. This is what happens when you take a monarch out. There has to be a scientific approach to keep all of them intact, where no one entity gets too much power. Freedom of the press, right to petition, right to bear arms, all those things were put in to try to take centralized power away. You see what I mean? And that's called political science. Human rights, abolition of slavery, abolition of public capital punishment like hangings. That used to be a symbol of the monarchy, showing their power over the common people by making an example of someone and executing them publicly. Debtors' prison. The Enlightenment philosophers said these have to go away in a modern society. So political science, and then you start to have science of the heavens. Galileo and Newton with calculus and Tycho Brahe, they describe the heavens in mathematics. They invent calculus, and they're using algebra, and they're mathematically explaining the heavens. So there's political science, then there's the science of the heavens, and then at about the same time you have military science. Napoleon comes up with his maxim. There's this obsession with science. Science is going to solve all of human problems. It comes out of the Renaissance. That replaced the Middle Ages. Well, it's strange how human memory works. Right about the time of the 1800s, science was producing itself in the form of industrialization, which was destroying the craft system, making people appendages to a machine, creating wages in place of the pride and joy of building a product from beginning to end, like a clock or a pair of shoes. And so you worked on an assembly line eventually over time. Full assembly would come later, but bits and pieces of assembly come in the early 1800s. And people in the early 1800s said, we're tired of science and logic and reason in every area. We want to think. We want to feel. We want to use our intuition. We want to use our instinct. We want to use our imagination. That's your right brain. Logic is your left brain. They had had enough of logic in every form of science. And it led to Byron, Shelley, Keats, Victor Hugo. You've read The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Charles Dickens, who wrote about the three ghosts in the Christmas Carol or Scrooge. Henry David Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, Poe. These are all considered romantic writers. The romanticists wanted you to think, feel, imagine, intuition, instinct, imagination, right brain. They were tired of being an appendage to a machine and all the arts and the crafts disappearing in favor of assembly lines and of people being brought under this strong scientific order. And so that fueled a feeling in the 19th century for what's called essentially the Romantic movement. Romantic meaning thinking, feeling. Wars were fought in that romantic notion at the beginning of the Civil War. You face your accuser out in the open like a gentleman's duel on a grand scale. You fire your pistol or your rifle, and that person or you yourself, by facing your accuser to regain your honor in a chivalric sort of way, and your family's reputation, you may walk around the rest of your life with a bullet lodged in your body and people see you limp, but you regained your reputation. And the idea of heraldry and family genealogy and defending one's reputation, that's all medieval ideas that came circling back. And the Victorian notion of prim and proper. Prim and proper. You had to wrap up Victorian culture in 2 words. It's prim and proper. Right? It's exactly. I mean, they wouldn't call a toilet a toilet. It had to be called a looking glass because the toilet is an indecent term. If you went to a music concert and there was a piano stage with animal legs, you had to cover it with frills. If you've ever seen a Victorian, there's crepe around the legs. For gosh sakes, why? It's so you wouldn't have to look at uncovered carved wooden animal legs in concert. That's indecent. So Victorians were uptight about how ladies act and gentlemen act. They were obsessed with that. And that comes from the chivalric code. So, yeah, all of that came. And by the way, Lincoln addressed that in the Gettysburg Address. He spoke right to the culture. I didn't get into all of the address, but he said in his, this would be the 3rd stanza, he said, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. That's another way of saying this is prim and proper. He's basically saying, I know how this culture is. It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. What he's trying to tell them is Victorians invented the funeral parlor. Did you know that? They're the first people. The Egyptians did it thousands of years ago. But they're the first. In the Middle Ages they did. Have you ever seen sepulchres in a cathedral? Going in, and there are these marble sepulchres. They're the outlay of a person's body. Do you know people in medieval cathedrals are buried in the floor? So when you went to Mass, they're under your feet and their names are carved on slate. And sepulchres are all around that caskets to look like the person's image of saints all around you. All right. 19th century people took that idea and created the funeral parlor. There was no such thing as a funeral parlor before the 19th century. They took the parlor, a person would die. In the 1700s, if a person died, they were buried before sunset of the day that they died. By the mid-19th century, you embalmed them with arsenic and formaldehyde. You put them in a casket with a glass window. You put them in your parlor where people could walk off the street and view them for a week to make sure they were really dead. That was part of it too. And also to make sure they wanted their organs to decay for a week so that grave robbers wouldn't go in and take the body after it was buried to an anatomy school, because it was illegal then to operate on a cadaver unless they were a criminal and had no right. But medical schools like Harvard Medical School needed those bodies, so there was this whole underground market of exhuming the body. That's why you go into Victorian cemeteries and they have big stone slabs over some of the graves and walk-in crypts for people who could afford it because they knew that this was going on. Bodies were being exhumed after the person died, taken in a side door at a medical school. Victorians were worried that if their organs were moved around in their body after they died, it threatened their chance of getting to a good place after they died. They wanted their body perfect when they died. I hadn't planned to say this, and leave any time you like here, but I recommend Drew Gilpin Faust's book called A Republic of Suffering. She's the president of Harvard. She spoke here in 2013 on the book, and she addresses this probably better than anyone, that in the 19th century, people were very anxious about purgatory. The 1500s had introduced the Protestant Reformation, and by the 1800s, a lot of people were divided, particularly Protestants, on whether purgatory existed. Purgatory is that period after you die where you can still get to a good place. There's certain things happen here on earth, prayers and candles and so forth. And the Protestant Reformation called into question purgatory. So Drew Gilpin Faust said that created an anxiety in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and she's focused on the 19th century, the 1800s. She writes on the Civil War in this book. She said a lot of Victorians were anxious that if the meter stopped ticking the moment they died and there was no time after purgatory to get to a good place, and heaven and hell are real places then you have to die perfectly now because there's nothing to be done after you die. So Victorians became obsessed with perfecting death, embalming the person, putting flowers. We put flowers around graves today, around graves and in the funeral home. The idea of flowers comes from Victorians. They put flowers around the casket in the parlor to cover the smell. Victorians invented the funeral home. And then they had these elaborate, I'm sure you've seen it, black wagons with glass windows, and they wore black and black gloves and black hats, and they would, in any case, what they would do also sometimes to perfect them in death is they would take a picture of them in the casket or right after they died. And that's because the New Testament rarely mentions the word death. It's usually sleeping and resting. The idea it's not final. That a trumpet will sound one day and the dead will be caught up first. Raptura is the word, Latin word. And then the living second. Well, if the person dies, you want to take a picture of them with their eyes open because this is not the end and this is how they're going to look on the day of resurrection. So they took pictures of them when they died. They cut lots of hair and preserved it and wove it with other family members' hair in a shadow box above the fireplace on the mantle, that we call a hair weave. There were all these rituals to perfect death. Some soldiers on the operating table wouldn't take ether because they didn't want their head clouded if they died. It might affect getting to the hereafter in a perfect state. If their organs are moved around in a laboratory, even in the name of science, that could compromise the hereafter. Pick up Republic of Suffering. It gets into some of that. But the Victorians were obsessed with, and Lincoln addresses that. And when he says, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground, the brave men living, dead who suffered here, consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. What he's saying is that many people will give up something for freedom. These people gave up everything for freedom. The last full measure, he said. And how can you add or detract to that? I mean, you can wear the best looking tuxedo and you can clip their hair and you can take a picture and you can put them on display and make sure you pay extra to have them embalmed and you can make sure there's a slab over their body. You can do all of these things to give them a good chance to hereafter. But in reality, Lincoln's saying they already gave the last full measure. There's nothing you can do to add or detract. And so then he refocuses them to, you need to be about the business of the living. Finish the great task that they started. Don't focus on perfecting their death. They've already perfected themselves in death. That's what he's saying. Did you know the soldiers out there are buried with footstones instead of headstones? There's all these rings, semicircles of rings, and the soldiers are buried in these rings. Well, you see their names on these rings, these series of concentric rings, and you see their names. Well, if you could see some sort of x-ray of whatever remains of their molecular structure, you would see their feet are touching their names on the ring. Why is that? So when the trumpet sounds one day, they'll stand up on their name and be caught up, and the panoramic shape of the cemetery allows them, as they're caught up, the dead first and then the living, to be able to look out across the battlefield where they perfected themselves for eternity by dying for human freedom. That's how elaborate Victorians went into perfecting you in time of death. That goes back to the Middle Ages. You go into a medieval cathedral. Remember I said this. You go in there, and the dead are buried under your feet, and there are candles on both sides of the cathedral being burned constantly, related to, there's more of an emphasis there on purgatory. But there's this constant emphasis. In Mexico, they have the Day of the Dead, but there was a strong emphasis in Victorian culture on making sure we get this death perfect. With this, Lincoln said it's fitting and proper that we're doing this, but it really, we should be thinking about finishing the task that they started. Well, what a real honor that you all stayed around all this long. I'll call my wife afterwards, and she'll say, "No way, they didn't stay that long, did they?" And nobody got up and left. But thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.